Hello everyone, welcome to another lesson of Biology 11 of our Unit 1, the diversity of living things. So we have moved quite a bit through the various kingdoms, kingdom bacteria, archaea, then we moved to the domain eukarya with the kingdoms protista, fungi, plantae, and today we're going to enter the kingdom Animalia. I selected this collage of different members of the kingdom Animalia just to see the diversity that we encounter in this kingdom, in the kingdom Animalia. So let's start with looking at common features. What all animals, including us, humans, have in common. So we're going to start looking at what kind of features you might start thinking as you look at the following pictures that I put up here. So we have a starfish, an anemone, snail, a frog, fish, parrots, a ladybug, and a monkey. And then you start thinking, okay, the first feature, we're all made up of cells, but they're multicellular, so they're made of more than one cell. A second feature is that these cells are eukaryotic, so they have a true nucleus surrounded by a nuclear membrane. These organisms are all heterotrophic, meaning they're consumers, and that means that they don't produce their own food, so they need to acquire the food by ingesting other organisms. They have mobility, so they're able to move in most stages of their life. In some cases they might not move on a particular stage of their life, and we get to those ones when we look at the sponges. It's an example where the mobility is restricted. They tend to be sessile, fixed in one position, but in other phases of the life cycle they have mobility. And as you see here, they all reproduce sexually. That means they're going to produce gametes that fuse through fertilization and produce an embryo, and the embryo is going to undergo different stages of development. So those are the common characteristics of all animals. There are two main groups in the kingdom Animalia. So we're going to look at those two groups. The first group is the group called the invertebrate. And invertebrates are characterized by the lack of a notochord. And they divide in about 34 phyla and includes many different species and organisms such as sponges, cnidarians, which are hydra and jellyfish, worms, mollusks, that includes clams, mussels, snails, octopus. Then we have the echinoderms, include the starfish. The arthropods, we have insects, spiders, lobsters, shrimp, scorpions, bees, and beetles. So all these organisms belong to the group Invertebrata or invertebrate. And these are some of the examples that we have in here. So we have a butterfly, we have anemones, and so forth. The second group is known as the vertebrates, and they're characterized by the presence of specific characteristics. The most notorious one is the presence of a notochord. And a notochord is no more than a rod or cartilage that runs lengthwise along the dorsal surface and beneath the nerve cord. So this is a diagram where it shows you here an organism with the different body parts, mouth, anus, and we have here a neural tube, and the notochord is running right underneath that or beneath the nerve cord. This is the neural tube. So I highlighted it in red so you can see, and that's the notochord. Now the notochord is found in chordate animals, which are vertebrates. It occurs only in the embryo stages, the notochord, and is replaced by a cartilage or bone structure known as the spine later in development. So it's only present in the embryo stages, and it's going to be replaced by a cartilage and later on becomes the spine in later development. So this is an example of a lizard with a notochord in the early stages only. In the mature one, it gets to be replaced by a cartilage or bone structure. Now let's look at the importance of animals and the variety of all these animals. So this collage again shows you the different animals that we have studied, from protists, fungi, plants, and then on the kingdom Animalia we have all these species. So this is to illustrate that the biodiversity is much higher with organisms from this kingdom, the kingdom Animalia, and specifically the invertebrates. So the invertebrates account for about 2/3 of all living organisms on Earth. And what is the criteria that biologists have used to classify animals? They use several major criteria. The first criterion is called levels of organization. And you can ask the question, does the animal have tissues, or are tissue organized into organs or organ systems? And then we are going to see if that's the case. So remember, in your biology 10, you study the different levels of organization. So cells become organized into structures known as tissues, and those tissues can get higher organized into organs that perform specific functions, and these organs get together, several organs, to form a system, and several systems will form the organism. So the levels of organization is a criterion used to classify animals. The second criterion is the number of body layers. The third one is the symmetry and body plans. The third one is the presence of a body cavity. Fifth one is the presence of segmentation in the body, the movement, the ability to move, and the types of reproduction that they undergo. So let's continue with number 2 in the next slide, the body layers. So actually number 2 here is called number of body layers. And the question here is, does the animal have 2 or 3 embryonic layers? So all organisms during their embryonic development, animals are thought to develop most of their parts from 3 specific layers. And this hypothesis or theory, this theory is called the germ layer theory. This germ layer theory states that the organs and systems of the body develop from one of the embryonic layers. So the layers are the endoderm, mesoderm, or ectoderm. So these 3 layers are forming during the development of the embryo. And if we look again here, this is an embryo being developed inside the mother. In most animals, in developed animals like mammals, the embryo is surrounded by an amniotic cavity containing the amniotic fluid. There's the yolk sac lined with the endoderm. We have the amnion, and we have the endometrium, the walls of the uterus that nourish the embryo, and so forth. So the 3 layers are shown here. The endoderm, endo means inner layer, so it's in yellow. Then we have the mesoderm, that's next to it, and the outermost is the ectoderm layer. The endoderm layer will give rise or develop into the digestive systems, the liver, the pancreas, the lungs, and the inner layers of the lungs. The mesoderm will become the circulatory system, the lungs, the epithelial layers of the lungs, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the ectoderm, which is the one outside, is going to become the hair, the nails, the skin, and the nerves, the nervous system. So these are the 3 layers known, and when the biologists use that theory, the germ layer theory, is to talk about that most body parts are going to arise from the development, they arise from or evolve from these 3 layers in the embryonic state. So now that you know this germ layer theory and you are able to recognize the names of the 3 layers, the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm, and know what organs or tissues are going to derive. This is a criterion that biologists are going to use to classify animals. So moving along, we're going to go to the third criterion. The third criterion is the type of body plans, or the symmetry. So different groups of animals have different arrangement of cells, tissues, and organs. The arrangement of those cells, tissues, and organs is known as symmetry. And there are two basic types of symmetry. Radial symmetry is a symmetry around a central axis. So if we were to look, for example, at this hydra, there's a central axis and we can have several planes. So there's a central point in here, and we can form mirror images, two mirror image halves along different planes. The organisms that display this type of radial symmetry tend to remain anchored in one spot or move very slowly. The second type of symmetry is known as bilateral symmetry, and that refers to a symmetry around a midline. So I chosen here, this is a lobster, and if we were to look at the midline over the dorsal surface, we can have this plane represents the midline. So you have the left and the right side. That's bilateral symmetry. So as humans, if you put your hand over your nose, you're going to have a left part of your face and right part of your face, and they could be fairly symmetrical. The more symmetric you are, the closer you are to be a model. So once this is divided into two mirror images halves in only one way. And organisms that display bilateral symmetry are very active and move around much more than animals that display the radial symmetry, because they tend to remain anchored in some parts of the life cycle. They might be mobile in other parts of the life cycle. Within this criterion, we have to look at something that is called the development of the mouth and the anus in the criterion used to classify organisms, the animals. So bilaterally symmetrical animals are further divided into two major branches. The protostomes and the stereostomes are distinguished by different patterns or embryonic development. So these are the two types of embryonic development. When an egg gets fertilized by the sperm, it is going to undergo a series of divisions and form a hollow sphere. So all the cells that the egg, once it's fertilized, it undergoes mitosis and is going to form this structure known as a blastula. This blastula is in development, undergoes invagination of some layers that move inwards, forming an opening or called a blastopore. And they carry on to continue, and eventually they're going to form here some cavities called the coelom. That is very important. But what is important here in this development is that because of the type of cell divisions that are happening here, the types of cell divisions can be spiral or radial. It leads to which organ is going to form first. So in the case of protostome, the mouth forms first and then the anus is after. And there's the cavity on the side. In the case of the deuterostomes, during the embryonic development, they had the blastopore. This opening here becomes the anus. The anus forms from the blastopore, and then the mouth is going to form later. So those are the two types of bilateral symmetry and the development of the mouth and the anus that are used as criteria to classify animals. So a protostome animal, to summarize, is an animal with bilateral symmetry. During embryonic development, the mouth forms before the anus. Whereas a deuterostome is an animal with bilateral symmetry, during which the embryonic development, the anus forms before the mouth. So the anus is forming before the mouth. Now, moving along to the other criterion is the presence of body cavities. And I touch a little bit when I show you those cavities during the embryonic development from a blastula to gastrula and the formation of those invaginations. So the question here the biologists always ask when they classify an animal is, does the animal have a true body cavity? Or is it partially formed, or is it absent? Right? So the coelom contains the internal organs. That cavity is called a coelom. The body cavity or coelom. And these are the three types of organisms that can be encountered. These organisms is lacking a coelom. So these are the embryonic three layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And inside the mesoderm, in the green circle here, it forms a cavity. So when there's a cavity, there's the coelomate. Eucoelomates means true coelomate. They have a cavity, and that includes annelids, worms, mollusks, arthropods, echinoderms, and chordates. So we're here as humans. Humans are chordates. We're right here with coelomates. And acoelomates, in biology, a means lacking. Acoelomates would be an example. The flatworms, The flatworms don't have that cavity to hold internal organs. So the flatworm is shown here. The annelid, Glycera, is shown here, and that's going to have cavities to hold important organs. And these ones is called a pseudocoelomate. It's not a very clear formation of the cavity. So the cavity, instead of being separated, is just one single ring within the mesoderm. So the mesoderm is in here and develop this pseudocoelomate, which is not a true cavity. Pseudo means not true, but its organs get to be placed in here. So we have the three types of organisms: acoelomate, coelomate or eucoelomate, and the pseudocoelomate, and examples of each. So in humans, coelomates, is good to look a little bit more in detail, those body cavities. The coelomate, the fluid-filled space inside the body lined with a layer of cells called the peritoneum or peritoneum. The peritoneum holds our organs. It's located between the body wall and the gut, the digestive tract. And it protects and contains organs. So this is something that as we grow older, some of these membranes become a little bit worn out, and it's prompt for many humans to have a condition known as hernia. Hernia means damage to this layer, the peritoneum, gets punctured, and the danger of that is that the organs might move from the cavity into the walls of the body here and create a bulging. So it can create major trouble, such as the organs coming through the rupture of the peritoneum and the blood supply being cut off. So that's one of the dangers of having hernias, and needs to be treated with surgery. So basically they fix the peritoneum by stitching up the patient and moving the inner organs inside. So I chose this because it's important to understand in the case of humans how that body cavity, the coelom, is very important to hold, to keep all the internal organs safe in that space. Less complex invertebrates may have an intermediate structure, the pseudocoelomate, which is fluid-filled space of variable shape and has no peritoneum. So in the case of the pseudocoeloms that I showed you before, they don't have this membrane that protects further that layer called the peritoneum. They don't have the lining of the coelom with that layer. It's called the pseudocoelom. The fifth criteria used by biologists to classify organisms is the segmentation of the body. So they ask themselves the question: is the body divided into repetitive sections or segments? That's referred to as segmentation, the division of the body into repetitive sections or segments. And the examples include bodies of roundworms or scorpions. As I show you here, for example, this is an organism that has segments, and those segments are going to have specific characteristics. They have advantages of having segmented bodies. This is a lobster also that displays segmentation, even that we have two major body parts. We have the abdomen and the cephalothorax. The cephalothorax is the fusion of the head with the chest cavity, where some organs can be in here. And there's the other cavity in here. So this one has the two cavities, but they're segmented. What is the advantage of having a segmented body? If a segment is damaged, others continue to function properly because they have repetitive or they're identical repeats. So all the essential organs are in each of these segments. Mobility is more effective also because the segments move independently. And you might have seen centipedes and millipedes that have many legs coming out of each segment, so they move fairly fast and it's difficult to catch. So that they having all these segments and all these limbs for movement allow them to be very effective at escaping preyers, for example, or predators. The sixth criteria is movement. So the evolution of a nerve and muscle tissue allow the development of complex, both complex and fast movement modes. For example, sponges and sea anemones are sessile as adults, but as juveniles they travel. They can move from one place to another one. The seventh criterion for classification of animals is reproduction. So we know that animals reproduce sexually by the formation of gametes, the sperms and the eggs. But it's here what biology refers to as the mode of fertilization. And in some cases also there must be a switch between a sexual way of reproduction to an asexual. There's a few cases that I'm going to show you here in a moment. So when they talk about fertilization mode, they refers to two. The external fertilization, it means the gametes combine outside the body, common in fish and amphibians. So when there's a spawning, let's say they talk about fish get to a stage where they spawn, it means they lay the eggs in the water and then the male would come and fertilize and spray with sperm cells to fertilize those eggs. So the fertilization is external, outside the body. As opposed to internal fertilization, in which the gametes combine inside the body. And this is the one that's common in mammals, so they need to have internal fertilization. Now, although I mentioned to you early on that most animals reproduce sexually by the formation of gametes, some animals can reproduce both sexually and asexually by alternating modes. And they reserve a sexual reproduction mode for when the environment changes and tough conditions occur. So when the conditions are not very suitable for growth development, become difficult to live, then they choose to reproduce sexually, because sexually allows for diversity and the recombinant process of the DNA to form new possible phenotypes or new expressions of organisms that are going to be better suited for the new changes in the environment. So that's sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction would be when the environment remains steady or constant. So the organisms that do that are planaria, which is a flatworm, starfish. Starfish actually can split into two, and they grow the other half. And aphids, which are insects, green insects that are parasitic to plants, and they feed on the flowing tissue, they also can reproduce asexually without undergoing fertilization of gametes. So they basically clone themselves. Now, to end our lesson, I'm going to give you an overview of the evolutionary relationships of animals with a phylogenetic tree. So remember, phylogeny is the study of the evolutionary relationships among groups of organisms. So in this case, we're going to look at the phylogenetic tree of animals. Animals are thought to originate from a colonial coaloflagellate ancestor. This colonial coagulate ancestor is no more than a free-living, unicellular and colonial flagellate eukaryotes. And based on the information from evolutionary studies, we see that the development of the nerves can divide these organisms into two. So we have, for example, with no nerves, the development of the group of animals known as Porifera, phylum Porifera, which includes sponges. When the nerves are developed, so they have a nerve system, then these are going to have further development by the type of body plan. Either they have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry that we study. So if they have radial symmetry, that give rise to cnidaria. Cnidaria are hydras, jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. And with organisms that display bilateral symmetry, we can look at the development of the mouth and the anus during the embryonic stages and classify these organisms as protostomes or deuterostomes. So protostomes means that the mouth forms first in the protostomes. And in here we have further branching of organisms to form the phylum Platelmints. These platelmints include flatworms. Then we have the phylum Rotifera that includes rotifers. They have on the other side, these two are much closer together, they went within a clade. We have the mollusca, the phylum Mollusca, that includes clams, snails, and squid. And related to that, we have the Annelida. The phylum Annelida, representatives are the segmented worms, such as the earthworm. On the right side, we have these groups that tend to be more independent of these in here. They're the nematodes, that the representatives of the phylum nematodes are the roundworms. They tend to be parasitic, like the parasitic tape in the human. And then we have the phylum Arthropoda. Arthropoda includes crustaceans, such as crabs, insects, and spiders. And that all of these that I mentioned to you are organisms that display body development of the anus, known as the protostomes. So that means that the anus develops before the mouth. Sorry, the mouth develops before the anus. In the deuterostomes, the anus develops first. So deuterostomes include two major phyla, the Echinodermata, which are the sea stars and the sea urchins, and the Chordata, which are lancelets, tunicates, and all vertebrates. So in the future lessons, we're going to look at all these members of the animal kingdom, all these phyla, one by one, and see how much diversity they have, what kind of characteristics, and look again at the phylogeny of the evolutionary relationships of the members of each of these phylum. Thank you for listening.